The kind of tired that doesn't go away after sleep is the kind that settles into a man's bones when he's been carrying something heavy for too long. And by the time Doyle Mercer was 41, he had been carrying it for 3 years. His wife June had died in the spring. Not dramatically, not with a long goodbye, but quietly, the way a candle sometimes just stops instead of flickering. An aneurysm? She was 38. She had been laughing at something on television, and then she wasn't. Their daughter, Clara, had been 7 years old and asleep in the next room, and Doyle had sat on the kitchen floor for a long time before he picked up the phone to call anyone. That was 3 years ago. He didn't talk about it much. There wasn't anything left to say about it that made it easier, so he mostly just got up in the morning, made Clara's lunch, drove her to school, and then went to work. He worked as a diesel mechanic at a mid-sized freight company outside of Columbus, Ohio. He had been working there for 14 years. He was good at it. Exceptionally good. The kind of good that people who don't understand engines never quite believe because it doesn't look impressive from the outside. It just looks like a man with grease on his hands, crouching under something heavy, listening. But Doyle could hear a problem in an engine the way some people hear a wrong note in a song. He had saved the company a significant amount of money over the years by catching failures before they became disasters. And he knew this, and he also knew that no one in the administrative building knew his last name. He had applied for the floor supervisor position when it opened up in September. He had been told, politely, that they were looking for someone with a degree. He didn't have one. He had finished 2 years of community college before his father got sick, and he had to come home, and then there had been a mortgage, and then there had been Clara, and at some point the incomplete credits had just become a fact of his life. The same way his left knee aching in cold weather was a fact of his life. The rejection hadn't surprised him. That didn't mean it hadn't hurt. What the woman from HR had said, specifically, was that his experience was valuable and appreciated, and that they hoped he would continue contributing at his current level. He had thanked her and walked back to the floor and slid under a Kenworth that needed a new fuel injector and didn't say anything to anyone for the rest of the day. Clara had noticed at dinner. She was 10 now and noticed most things. "You seem far away," she said, which was something June used to say, and the accuracy of it landed somewhere between his ribs. "Long day," he said. She accepted this. She was good at accepting things she couldn't change. His daughter, which was either a sign of remarkable emotional intelligence or the quiet inheritance of a child who had learned early that some absences are permanent. He wasn't sure which one it was, and the uncertainty was its own kind of weight. He had sent out 4 other applications after that. A regional trucking company, a private logistics firm, a manufacturing plant that needed a maintenance manager, and one position, the one he had spent the most time on, filling out the forms carefully, late at night after Clara was in bed, at a company called Vantage Industrial Solutions. The position was Operations Maintenance Director. It was more than a step up, it was a different floor entirely. He knew that. He sent it anyway. He didn't hear back from any of them for 3 weeks. On a Thursday evening in late November, his neighbor came over to sit with Clara while he drove to the grocery store. He had been planning to be in and out in 20 minutes. He was not in and out in 20 minutes. The grocery store had a bar attached to it. One of those modern hybrid spaces that had become common in the last decade. The kind where you could get a glass of wine while you decided between pasta sauces. Doyle didn't drink much, but he had developed the habit of stopping for a single beer on Thursday evenings when Clara was being watched, just to have somewhere quiet to sit that wasn't his own house. He would sit for 20 minutes and read something on his phone, and then go get his groceries and go home. It was a small ritual, and small rituals were holding him together more than he would have admitted. He was on his second sip when he noticed the couple at the table nearest the window. He didn't mean to notice them. It wasn't his business, but the bar was not large, and the man was speaking in the specific way that makes nearby strangers become involuntary witnesses. Not loud exactly, but precise. The way a blade is precise, meant to cut without drawing attention. The woman across from him was sitting very still. She was in her early 40s, professionally dressed, dark hair pulled back, and she had the expression of someone who had been smiling so long that the smile had gone somewhere else and left only its shape behind. The man, heavyset, wedding ring, the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered to him, was explaining something to her with elaborate patience, the kind of patience that isn't patience at all but its cruelest cousin. "You're doing that thing again," Doyle heard him say, "where you take what I'm saying personally." She said something quiet. He couldn't make it out. "I'm just pointing out," the man continued, setting his glass down with a small precision that was not gentle, "that you tend to make this kind of situation more complicated than it needs to be." Doyle looked at his beer. He looked at the door. He looked back. He had been married for 9 years. He knew the difference between a disagreement and something else. This was something else. He also knew, in the part of himself that had learned caution the hard way, that getting involved in strangers' business was almost never received the way it was intended. He was not a large man in the way that invites confrontation. He was lean and quiet, and looked like what he was, a man who worked with his hands. And he had long since understood that the world did not particularly defer to men who looked like him. But the woman looked up for a moment, not at him, just up, the way a person looks up when they are trying to find somewhere to put their eyes that isn't the face in front of them. And what he saw in that look was not distress exactly. It was exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been managing another person's behavior for too long, and has quietly stopped believing that the evening will improve. He knew that exhaustion. He had seen it, once, in a mirror he hadn't expected. He picked up his phone and opened his contacts and pretended to read something. Then he stood up and walked to the table and said, "Claire, I'm sorry, I saw you from over there and I wasn't sure if it was you." The woman looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes, surprise, then a quick, sharp assessment. "Doyle," she said, and the steadiness of it told him she was fast on her feet. "I know we've been trying to connect," he said, keeping his voice easy, conversational. "I'm sorry it took me this long to get over here. Is this a bad time?" The man at the table had gone still with the particular stillness of someone recalibrating. "No," the woman said, and she stood up. "Actually, the timing is fine." She looked at the man across from her with a politeness so precisely controlled it bordered on surgical. "I'm sorry, I need to go. I hope you have a safe drive home." The man said her name, not Claire, her actual name, which Doyle registered without meaning to, and his voice had the edge of someone unaccustomed to a conversation ending before he chose to end it. She picked up her bag and walked with Doyle toward the door. Outside, the November air was cold and direct, and smelled of wet pavement. They stood under the overhang and she exhaled once, slowly. "Thank you," she said. "I'm sorry if I read that wrong," Doyle said. "I wasn't trying to make assumptions. You didn't read it wrong." He nodded. "I'm Renata," she said. "Renata Solis Stay, Doyle Mercer." They shook hands in the slightly awkward way of people who have just shared something honest without intending to. "Are you going to be all right getting to your car?" he asked. "Yes, he's not dangerous, he's just." She paused and seemed to decide that the end of that sentence was not necessary. He's just who he is. Doyle understood this in a way he didn't try to explain. "Take care of yourself," he said. She said she would. He went back inside, finished half his beer, bought his groceries, and drove home. He told Clara the store had been crowded. He did not think too much about the woman named Renata Solis, because thinking too much about things he couldn't change was a habit he had spent 3 years trying to break. He forgot her name by Saturday. He got the call about the Vantage position on Monday morning. He almost didn't answer. He didn't recognize the number, and he was underneath a truck, and his phone was in his jacket pocket, 6 feet away, and by the time he got to it, the call had gone to voicemail. He listened to the message in the parking lot, standing next to his car, while the wind off the flat Ohio fields did what November wind does. The message was from someone named Patricia in Human Resources at Vantage Industrial Solutions. They would like to have him in for a first-round interview on Wednesday. The interview would be with a small panel. He would need to allow 2 hours. He listened to it twice. Then he called his neighbor to ask if she could pick Clara up from school on Wednesday, and she said yes. And he said thank you. And when he hung up, he stood very still for a moment in the way a man stands when something he has almost stopped, wanting suddenly becomes possible again. He prepared. He prepared more carefully than he had prepared for anything in a long time. He pulled out everything he had, the maintenance logs he had kept over the years, the records of downtime reduced, the money he could demonstrate having saved. The 2 instances where his intervention had prevented what would have been significant equipment failures. He organized it into a folder, printed copies, read the company's last 3 annual reports online in the evenings after Clara was in bed. He wasn't sure what the panel would ask him. He had been through enough interviews to know that the question that mattered was never the one you expected. Wednesday came the way Wednesdays always do, which is not gently. He wore the jacket June had helped him pick out years ago for a funeral, which was the nicest thing he owned that fit. He drove 40 minutes to the Vantage offices, which were in a glass building on the edge of a business park, and he sat in the lobby and watched people move through the space with the ease of people who belong somewhere, and he felt briefly like a man who had wandered into the wrong waiting room. He told himself what he always told Clara when she was nervous, that he already knew what he knew, and walking into a room didn't change that. A young man came out to collect him and walked him down a corridor to a conference room with a long table and 3 chairs on one side and 1 chair on the other, and Doyle sat down in the single chair, set his folder on the table, and looked up. The woman in the center chair looked back at him. She was in her early 40s, but professionally dressed, dark hair pulled back, and for a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, neither of them said anything. He placed her immediately. He knew he had, and he could see, in the precise stillness of her expression, that she had placed him too. She said evenly, "Mr. Mercer, thank you for coming in." "Thank you for having me," he said with the same steadiness, because the steadiness was the only thing that made sense. The 2 people beside her, a man in his 50s who introduced himself as the VP of Operations and a younger woman who was the outgoing director, did not appear to notice that anything had passed between the 2 of them. Why would they? Nothing had passed between them, not visibly. Not in a way that had a name. The interview proceeded. They asked him standard questions first. Background, experience, how long at his current company, why was he looking to move, where did he see himself in 5 years? He answered carefully and without performance, which had always been the only way he knew how to answer questions. He wasn't a man who expanded himself to fill a room, he just said what was true. Then Renata Solis leaned forward slightly, and the texture of the room changed. "I want to ask you something that's a little outside the standard format," she said. "Is that all right?" He said it was. "Tell me about a time you saw something that wasn't working," she said. "That wasn't technically your responsibility to fix, and what you did about it." He didn't rush to answer. He had learned, over years of diagnosing engines, that the first sound is not always the sound you need to listen to. He told her about a situation from 4 years ago, before June died, when he had noticed a pattern in the fuel consumption data that no one had asked him to look at. It wasn't his job, he was a mechanic, not an analyst. But the pattern bothered him the way certain silences bother him under a hood, and so he had spent 3 evenings working through the numbers, and what he found was that a scheduling inefficiency was causing a specific set of trucks to run longer warm-up cycles than necessary in cold weather, and that the compounding cost over a year was significant. He had put together a simple summary and left it on his floor manager's desk, without being asked. The floor manager had thanked him and passed it up the chain. Doyle had never heard anything more about it. He assumed the information had been useful because the scheduling changed the following spring. He had not received any recognition for it. He said this last part without bitterness. It was just what had happened. The VP of Operations was making a note. The outgoing director was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Renata Solis was looking at him steadily and not writing anything down. They asked several more questions. He answered them all in the same way, directly, without embellishment, conceding the things he didn't know, explaining the things he did. He made no claims he couldn't support. He offered no version of himself that was larger or more impressive than the actual version. When it was over, the VP shook his hand and said they expected to be in touch within the week. The outgoing director thanked him for his time. He picked up his folder and stood, and Renata Solis stood as well, and said she would walk him out. They walked the length of the corridor in silence. At the elevator, she pressed the button, and while they waited, she said, without looking at him, "If you had known who I was that night, what I do, what company this was, that you would be standing in this building the next morning, would you have done anything differently?" He considered the question the way he considered all questions that deserved consideration. "No," he said. She looked at him then. "I didn't help you because of what you might be able to do for me," he said. "I helped you because of what was happening in front of me." The elevator arrived. He stepped in. She held the door for a moment. "Your file is strong, Mr. Mercer," she said. "The panel will be in touch." He thanked her. The doors closed. He drove back toward Columbus through the flat gray light of a November afternoon, and somewhere around the halfway point, with the fields going brown on either side of the highway and the heater running steady, he thought about Clara, who was in school right now doing something with fractions, probably, and who would ask him tonight how it went, and to whom he would not yet know what to say. He thought about the question Renata Solis had asked him in the corridor. He had answered it without hesitation, and that was the part he kept returning to, not the words, but the absence of hesitation. It had not been a hard question for him. He wasn't entirely sure what that meant about him. June would have said it meant something good. He thought about June less than he used to, and more than he showed. 3 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, while Clara was at a friend's house, his phone rang with the number he now recognized. Patricia from Vantage HR said they had completed their evaluation, and that the panel had reached a decision. She said they were pleased to offer him the position of Operations Maintenance Director, pending background check and reference verification. She mentioned a salary that was substantially more than he was currently making. He said, "Thank you, I'd like that." After he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes without doing anything. The house was quiet. The refrigerator ran. A car passed on the street outside. He could see, through the window above the sink, the oak tree in the backyard that had lost most of its leaves, and the small wooden platform he had built up in its first fork 3 summers ago at Clara's insistence, which she called a thinking spot, and which she had mostly stopped using since she turned 9, but which he had never taken down because he wasn't sure she was finished with it yet. He picked up his phone and called his neighbor to say, Clara didn't need to come home early. After all, everything was fine, and then he set the phone down and he sat quietly in the kitchen that June had picked the paint color for, in the house where Clara was learning how to become the person she was going to be, in the life that had broken and not broken, in the particular silence of a man who has just had something go right after a long time of things being difficult. He was still sitting there when Clara came home an hour later, and when she dropped her bag in the hallway and came around the corner and saw his face, she stopped. "What happened?" she said. He told her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she sat down across from him, in the chair that had been June's chair, which they had stopped calling June's chair, but which would probably always be June's chair. And she looked at him with the serious, considering look she had when she was processing something that mattered. "Mom would have liked this," she said finally. He had been doing reasonably well up until that particular sentence. "Yeah," he said, "she would have." Clara reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, in the matter-of-fact way of a 10-year-old who understands that some moments don't need commentary, just company. Outside, the oak tree stood bare and patient in the gray November light, and the thinking spot sat empty, waiting for whoever needed it next.